The bankrupt millionaire let two homeless girls spend the night in his restaurant, and at dawn, he was paralyzed by what they had done. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying a cold rain that pounded against the foggy windows of what used to be the elegant restaurant called the Little Chateau. Inside the dim space, lit only by a single hanging light bulb above the counter, Thomas Lawrence, 55, watched the raindrops slide down the glass, forming patterns that seemed to mirror the course of his own life, once shining bright, now a murky shadow of what it had been. His fingers, once adorned with expensive rings, now calloused and stained, traced absent-mindedly around the rim of an empty wine glass. The tailored Italian suit he used to wear had been replaced by a worn-out sweater and pants that had certainly seen better days. His eyes, once lively and confident, were now sunken and weary, reflecting the weight of bad decisions and broken dreams. The wall clock, one of the few valuable items left, showed 9:43 p.m. with an unforgiving tick-tock, reminding Thomas that every second pulled him further away from his former life. The tables, previously covered with fine linen and reserved for the city's elite, now stood bare and dusty, silent witnesses to the collapse of the culinary empire he had built. A thunderclap shook the windows, startling Thomas. At that moment, he heard, almost lost under the roar of the storm, a faint sound at the back door. Frowning, he got up, his joints cracking in protest, and walked slowly across the creaking wooden floor. As he opened the door, the gust of wind nearly knocked him over. Blinking against the rain lashing his face, Thomas initially saw nothing but the stormy darkness. Then his eyes adjusted to two small trembling figures, nearly swallowed by the torrential downpour. Sophie, the older one at 10 years old, stood protectively in front of Claire, who was 6. Both were soaked to the bone, their hair plastered to their pale faces. Sophie's eyes, large and determined, contrasted with her blue-tinged lips that quivered in the cold. Claire, clutching her sister, held a drenched teddy bear, her eyes wide with fear and chill. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. His instinct for self-preservation, sharpened by his years of decline, screamed at him to shut the door. But something in Sophie's gaze, a blend of desperation and courage that he recognized from his own darker days, made him pause. "Come in," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The girls needed no second invitation. They stumbled inside, bringing with them the smell of rain and despair. Thomas closed the door, muffling the roar of the storm, and for a moment he stood there, unsure of what to do next. Sophie was the first to break the silence. "Please, sir," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "can we stay here tonight? Just until the rain stops." Thomas looked at them, noticing details he'd missed at first. Their clothes, though drenched, were of decent quality, but showed signs of long-term wear. Claire's shoes had holes, and Sophie's coat was patched in several places. There was a story there, he realized, one that echoed uncomfortably close to his own. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the kitchen. The girls exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to follow or run away. Moments later, Thomas reappeared carrying two large, faded towels. "Dry yourselves," he said, handing them the towels. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "I'll make something warm for you to eat." While the girls dried off, Thomas fired up the industrial stove, which hadn't been used in weeks. The familiar sound of the gas igniting and the gentle warmth of the flame brought back memories of bustling nights in the kitchen, filled with laughter, shouted orders, and the aroma of exquisite dishes. Now he stirred a simple vegetable soup, all that remained in his nearly empty pantry. The modest smell filled the kitchen, bringing a bit of life back to the abandoned space. When Thomas returned with 2 steaming bowls, he found Sophie and Claire sitting on one of the bar stools, their small forms looking even tinier in the restaurant's vast emptiness. Claire had stopped shivering, but still clung to her soggy teddy bear. Sophie, however, scanned the surroundings with sharp eyes, as though assessing their situation. "Eat," Thomas said, placing the bowls in front of them. "It'll help warm you up." The girls needed no further encouragement. They ate eagerly, blowing on each spoonful before gulping it down. Thomas watched them, feeling something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Compassion, responsibility. He couldn't quite name it. When they finished, Sophie looked at Thomas with eyes that seemed far older than her 10 years. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. "Can we stay here tonight? We promise we'll leave in the morning." Thomas looked at the girls, then at the storm still raging outside. Finally, his eyes landed on the clock midnight. He let out a long sigh. "There's a storage room in the back," he said at last. "There are some old blankets there. You can sleep there tonight." The relief on the girls' faces was palpable. As he guided them to the small storage area, Thomas couldn't help wondering what he was doing. For years he hadn't cared for anyone but himself. Why now? Closing the storage room door, leaving the girls settled among dusty boxes and memories of better times, Thomas found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. Not for himself, but for two little strangers who, for some twist of fate, had knocked on his door on that stormy night. As he walked back to his makeshift bedroom in the restaurant's office, Thomas could never have imagined how those two drenched little figures were about to change the course of his life forever. Dawn arrived with a pale light filtering through the little chateau's foggy windows. Thomas woke with a start, momentarily confused by the sounds coming from the kitchen. For an instant, his heart raced with the hope that everything, his bankruptcy, his solitude, his failure, had been just a nightmare. But reality hit when he saw his reflection in the office's cracked mirror, a tired face, unshaven, sunken eyes telling the story of his downfall. Entering the kitchen, he found Sophie carefully stirring something on the stove, while Claire sat at the table, hugging her now dry but still scruffy teddy bear. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, bringing a strangely comforting feeling. "Good morning, sir," Sophie said, her voice mixing respect with a maturity beyond her years. "I hope you don't mind. We found some eggs and bread. It's not much, but—" Thomas nodded silently, observing the girls with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He sat at the table and accepted the cup of coffee Sophie offered. Silence hung in the air, heavy with unasked questions and untold stories. Claire was the one who finally broke the silence. "Do you have a family, sir?" she asked, her small voice hesitant. The question hit Thomas like a punch in the gut. Images of his ex-wife, of long-forgotten family dinners, of a life that seemed to belong to someone else, flooded his mind. "No," he answered simply, his voice hoarse. "Not anymore." Sophie, sensing the change in atmosphere, placed the scrambled eggs on the table and sat beside her sister. Her eyes met Thomas's, and in that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them, the recognition of souls who knew loss. "We don't either," Sophie said softly. She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Our parents. They died 6 months ago." "Car accident." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he just nodded, encouraging her to continue. Sophie pressed on, her voice steady but underlined with pain. "It was a night like last night. Heavy rain, slippery road. Dad was always a careful driver, but—" She paused, swallowing hard. "The car skidded. They said it was instant." Claire let out a small sob, hugging the teddy bear against her chest. "I wish I had said, 'I love you,' just one more time," she murmured between tears. Thomas felt his heart tighten. He remembered the last time he'd spoken to his own family, the harsh words exchanged, the slammed doors. The bitterness of that memory made him instinctively reach out, gently touching Claire's shoulder. Sophie continued, her voice now barely containing her emotions. "After that, we went to a children's shelter. They were kind, I guess. But then we overheard the social workers talking. They wanted to separate us. Send Claire to one family and me to another." The idea clearly still terrified her. Thomas could see the fear in Sophie's eyes, the same fear he saw in the mirror each morning, the fear of being utterly alone in the world. "So, you ran away," Thomas concluded softly. Sophie nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We couldn't be apart. We're all each other has now." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen once again, filled with emotions left unspoken. Thomas found himself lost in his own memories, recalling his own downfall, the restaurant that was once his pride and joy, The rash decisions, the risky investments, the downward spiral that seemed never-ending. "I understand," he finally said, his voice low and laden with emotion. "Losing everything, a feeling like the whole world has turned its back on you." The girls looked at him, a spark of understanding shining in their young eyes. Thomas went on, words now flowing as though a dam had burst. "This restaurant, it was my life, my family. I built it from scratch, you know? Every dish, at every customer, every good review, that it was like a child to me." He paused, looking around the once immaculate kitchen, now worn and tired. "But then, one mistake led to another. Bad investments. Too much pride to admit I was sinking. Before I knew it, it was all gone." Claire, her large eyes filled with compassion, reached out her small hand to touch Thomas's arm. "It's okay, sir. Everyone makes mistakes." The simplicity and sincerity of those words struck Thomas deeply. He felt something break inside him, a wall he had built over years of bitterness and self-reproach. Sophie, watching closely, spoke with a wisdom beyond her years. Maybe we can help each other. We have nowhere else to go, and it seems like you need company as much as we do." Thomas looked at the two girls, Sophie with her strength and determination, and Claire with her innocence and compassion. He saw in them a reflection of himself, not as he was now, but as he used to be, full of hope, courage, and possibilities. For a moment, he hesitated. A voice of caution, nurtured by years of disappointments, warned him not to get involved, to protect the little he had left of his wounded heart. But looking into those young faces, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Maybe," he finally said, a small smile forming on his lips. "Maybe we can." As the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the kitchen in a golden glow, Thomas felt as though a new page was turning. Their stories, his and the girls', had become intertwined in a way none of them could have predicted. And in that moment, sitting at the table in his once-abandoned kitchen with two orphaned sisters who had somehow found their way into his hardened heart, Thomas felt for the first time in years that maybe, just maybe, there was a new chapter waiting to be written. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Thomas woke with a start from a dream he couldn't remember. The office, his makeshift bedroom for the past few months, was oddly quiet. He got up, stretching his aching back, and that was when he noticed a gentle, inviting aroma hung in the air. Intrigued and slightly apprehensive, Thomas walked toward the kitchen. As he approached, familiar sounds reached his ears: the soft clinking of utensils, the low bubbling of something on the stove, and, surprisingly, the muffled sound of children's laughter. Stepping into the main dining area, Thomas froze, his mouth falling open. The transformation was almost magical. The windows, once grimy and streaked, now sparkled, allowing the morning's golden light to flood the space. The wooden floor, long neglected, gleamed. The tables, which had collected dust for ages, were pristine and set. Yes, each table was meticulously arranged. White tablecloths, ones Thomas didn't even remember having, covered the surfaces. In the center of each, small bouquets of wildflowers brought color and life back to the room. The flowers, he realized, must have come from the overgrown garden at the back of the restaurant. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," Claire's cheerful voice broke through his stupor. The 6-year-old beamed at him, carrying more flowers in her small arms. "Do you like the flowers?" "I picked them all by myself." Thomas nodded, still at a loss for words, as he watched Claire carefully place the flowers into an improvised vase, an old wine bottle he remembered from better days. "Sophie's finishing breakfast," Claire went on, seemingly oblivious to Thomas's shock. "She said she learned a few recipes at the children's shelter." Right on cue, Sophie emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray. Her hair was tied back in a makeshift ponytail, and she wore one of Thomas's old aprons, far too big for her small frame. "Oh, you're awake," Sophie exclaimed, setting the tray on the counter. "I hope you don't mind. We thought we could, repay your kindness somehow." Thomas approached the counter slowly, taking in the tray's contents. A small stack of golden pancakes, a jug of what looked like orange juice, and a bowl of freshly cut fruit. Nothing fancy, but clearly made with care. You did all this?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. Sophie nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "It's not much, I know. But at the shelter, we sometimes helped in the kitchen. I learned the basics." Thomas picked up a fork and, almost reverently, cut a piece of pancake. Tasting it, he closed his eyes. It wasn't the most refined meal, certainly not something he would have served in the little chateau's glory days, but at that moment, it was the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted. "It's perfect," he murmured, opening his eyes to see the girls' hopeful expressions. The smile that lit up Sophie's and Claire's faces was like the sunrise itself, bright, warm, and full of promise. As they ate, Thomas couldn't help but notice how different the restaurant felt. It wasn't just the cleanliness or the flowers. There was an energy in the air, a sense of possibility. It was as though the building itself had awakened from a long slumber. "How did you manage all of this?" Thomas asked, gesturing around. Sophie shrugged, as though cleaning an entire restaurant was the most natural thing for a 10-year-old. "We got up early. We wanted to thank you for letting us stay." "And," Claire added with a mischievous grin, "Sophie said if we made everything look nice, maybe you'd let us stay a bit longer." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. The idea that these two girls, who barely knew him, had gone to so much trouble to impress him, it was something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. "You didn't have to do this," he said gently. "We wanted to," Sophie replied, her eyes meeting Thomas's with surprising intensity. "This place, like, it feels special, even though it's closed and all. You can tell it used to be amazing once." Thomas looked around, seeing the restaurant through the girl's eyes. Yes, it was worn down, in need of repairs and a good coat of paint. But the framework was still there, the potential, the soul of the place he had built with so much love and dedication. "It was amazing," he murmured, more to himself than to the girls. "And it can be again," Claire exclaimed, her eyes shining with childlike enthusiasm. "Can't it, Mr. Thomas?" He found himself smiling, a genuine smile, his first in a long time. "Maybe," he said, surprising himself with the hope in his own voice. "Maybe it can." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Thomas found himself showing the girls around the restaurant, sharing stories of busy nights and glowing reviews. Sophie soaked up every word, asking insightful questions about ingredients and techniques. Claire, meanwhile, was captivated by every detail of the decor, envisioning ways to make it even more beautiful. By midday, Thomas had barely noticed the time slipping away. The restaurant, long a monument to his failure, was now filled with renewed energy. The girls' laughter echoed against the walls, filling empty spaces that had stood silent for too long. Standing in the middle of the dining area, Thomas felt something shift inside him. The bitterness and despair that had been his constant companions these past months seemed to recede, replaced by something he dared not name: hope, purpose. Looking at Sophie and Claire, now happily debating which color would look best on the walls, Thomas realized something had changed. This wasn't just a bankrupt restaurant, a reminder of his failure. It was a new beginning. "Girls," he called, his voice stronger than it had been in months. Sophie and Claire turned, looking at him expectantly. "What do you say? We help each other out for a few more days." The smiles that lit up their faces were answer enough. And so, on that sunny morning in a once-shuttered restaurant, 3 lost souls found a new purpose. The little chateau, like its new inhabitants, was ready for a new chapter. The little chateau seemed to come alive more with each passing day. What began as an impromptu cleanup became a full-blown mission to restore the place. Driven by the girls' contagious enthusiasm, Thomas threw himself into tasks he had neglected for too long. That afternoon, while Thomas and Sophie discussed the possibility of reopening the kitchen for small events, Claire, ever curious, decided to explore the storage room at the back of the restaurant. It used to be an organized labyrinth of exotic ingredients and rare wines. But now it was a chaotic pile of dusty boxes and forgotten shelves. With the determination only a 6-year-old can possess, Claire began rooting through every nook and cranny. Her small fingers slid across surfaces, leaving tracks in the thick dust. That's when, pushing an old shelving unit, she felt something give way. "Sophie! Mr. Thomas!" she called out, her voice echoing through the storage room. "Come see this." Thomas and Sophie raced to the back, finding Claire wide-eyed with excitement, pointing to a small opening in the wall, revealed behind the shelf. "A secret passage!" Claire exclaimed, barely containing her glee. Thomas frowned, perplexed. "Impossible," he muttered, stepping closer to examine the opening. "I thought I knew every inch of this place." But there it was, undeniably, a tiny door, almost invisible, camouflaged in the storage room's wall. Carefully, Thomas pulled it open, revealing a cramped space no bigger than a closet. "Probably built by the previous owner," Thomas said, more to himself than to the girls. "I never knew—" Impatient, Claire squeezed through the gap, ignoring Thomas's protests. "There's something in here," she announced, her voice muffled. Moments later, she emerged carrying an object wrapped in a faded cloth. With great care, Claire unwrapped it, revealing an old book with yellowed pages and a worn leather cover. Thomas froze at the sight of it. His hands trembled slightly as he took it from Claire, his eyes scanning the familiar cover. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie, noticing Thomas's reaction, asked gently, "What is it, Mr. Thomas?" Thomas opened the book reverently, the pages crackling beneath his fingers. "It's my grandmother's recipe book," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it had been lost in a fire years ago." The girls leaned in, staring at the yellowed pages covered in elegant handwriting and detailed drawings of dishes and ingredients. "My grandmother was an incredible cook," Thomas continued, turning the pages carefully. "She taught me everything I know about food. This book, it was the heart and soul of the little chateau." Sophie, fascinated, peered at the recipes, taking in every detail. "This is amazing," she murmured. "Look, there are even instructions on how to grow your own herbs." Thomas nodded, a nostalgic smile on his lips. "My grandmother believed a true chef should understand every ingredient, from seed to finished dish." As Thomas continued flipping through the book, recalling long-forgotten meals and moments, Sophie pulled out an old notebook and began scribbling notes, her eyes alight with interest. Claire, sensing the significance of the moment, hugged Thomas around the waist. "See, Mr. Thomas, the restaurant wanted us to find the book. It's a sign." Thomas chuckled softly, resting a hand on Claire's shoulder. "Maybe you're right, little one." For hours, the three of them stayed in that storage room, Thomas sharing memories tied to each recipe, each story the book evoked. Sophie soaked it all in, asking sharp questions about techniques and flavor combinations. "Mr. Thomas," Sophie said finally, determination filling her voice, "can we try making one of these recipes?" Thomas hesitated for a moment. The idea of returning to the kitchen, of truly cooking again, thrilled and frightened him in equal measure. "Please," Claire chimed in, her large eyes pleading. With a sigh that was part resignation, part excitement, Thomas nodded. "All right, let's see what we can do with what's left in the kitchen." Suddenly, the little chateau's kitchen, silent for weeks, was alive again. Thomas' grandmother's recipe book open on the counter guided Sophie through the steps to make a ratatouille, a simple dish yet rich with personal meaning for him. "My grandmother always said the secret is in how you cut the vegetables," Thomas explained, demonstrating the proper technique. "Each piece should be the same size so they cook evenly." Sophie, her face set with intense focus, mimicked Thomas's motions. Though her hands were small and inexperienced, she showed surprising dexterity. Claire, determined not to be left out, was tasked with washing and sorting the herbs. She did it with comical seriousness, smelling each leaf with an air of importance. As the aromas began filling the kitchen, Thomas felt something stir within him. The familiarity of the movements, the sizzle of the vegetables in the pan, the scent of fresh herbs, all of it rekindled a passion he thought he had lost forever. Sophie, for her part, seemed to blossom in the kitchen. Her eyes sparkled with each new technique learned, each taste sampled. She asked insightful questions, absorbing every detail like a sponge. "You've got a natural talent, Sophie," Thomas commented, watching her add seasoning with a surprising precision for someone so young. Sophie blushed at the praise, but her smile was radiant. "It's like I always knew how to do this, you know? I just needed someone to show me." When the dish was finally ready, the three of them sat around the kitchen table to taste it. The first forkful transported Thomas instantly to his childhood, to Sundays in his grandmother's kitchen. "It's perfect," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Claire, her cheeks smudged with tomato sauce, nodded vigorously. "It's the best thing I've ever tasted." Sophie, however, frowned slightly. "I think we could have used a bit more time," she observed, tasting again, "and maybe cut the zucchini a bit thinner." Thomas looked at her, surprised and impressed. "You're absolutely right," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "You have an incredible palate, Sophie." At that moment, gazing at the two girls, Claire delighting in every bite with childish glee, Sophie critically analyzing every aspect of the dish, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. His grandmother's recipe book, rediscovered as if by a miracle, was not only a treasure from the past, it was a promise for the future. "Girls," Thomas said, his voice filled with newfound determination, "I think it's time we really bring the little chateau back to life. What do you say?" Claire's enthusiastic cheers and Sophie's radiant smile were all the answer he needed. Right there, in that long dormant kitchen, among the aroma of fresh herbs and the warmth of the stove, a new adventure was about to begin. Dawn found Thomas already in the little chateau's kitchen, his grandmother's cookbook open on the counter. His eyes scanned the yellowed pages, rediscovering techniques and flavor pairings he'd long forgotten. The sound of light footsteps made him look up to find Sophie standing in the doorway, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," she said, tying on an apron far too large for her small frame. "Where do we start today?" Thomas smiled, feeling a surge of enthusiasm he hadn't felt in years. "How about something classic? Coq au vin." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Isn't that, advanced?" Thomas laughed softly. "My grandmother always said, there are no advanced recipes, only inexperienced cooks. We'll take it step by step." As Thomas and Sophie pored over the recipe, Claire came into the kitchen, yawning and dragging her teddy bear. "Can I help too?" she asked, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Of course," Thomas replied, handing her a bowl. "How about washing these grapes for us?" Soon, the kitchen was filled with sounds and aromas, the wine reducing to a bubble, the bacon sizzling in the pan, the rich smell of fresh herbs. Thomas guided Sophie through each stage, explaining not just the how but the why of every technique. "See how we sear the chicken first," he explained. "That creates a layer of flavor that will deepen during the slow cooking." Sophie nodded, absorbing every detail. Her small hands, though inexperienced, carefully flipped the chicken at just the right time, adjusting the heat with care. Claire, having finished with the grapes, now watched in fascination. "Can I decorate the dish when it's done?" she asked, eyes shining with ideas. Thomas smiled. "Of course, presentation is as important as taste." As the morning wore on, the rich, inviting aroma of coq au vin filled every corner of the restaurant. Thomas found himself recalling busy nights, satisfied customers, impressed critics. For a moment, nostalgia and regret tugged at him. Noticing his shift in mood, Sophie gently touched his arm. "Is everything okay, Mr. Thomas?" He shook his head to clear it, returning to the present. Yes, just memories." Sophie nodded, far more understanding than most kids her age. "My mom always said cooking is like life. Sometimes it's a mess, sometimes it burns, but we can always start over." Thomas looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. "Your mother sounds like she was a very wise woman." "She was," Sophie said softly, a sad smile touching her lips. Their moment was broken by Claire, who arrived carrying a handful of flowers from the garden. "Look, we can use these to decorate the plate," Thomas chuckled, the melancholy fading. "Great idea, Claire. Let's see how we can include them." When the dish was finally finished, the three gathered around the kitchen table. The coq au vin was beautifully plated, On an old serving dish Thomas had found in the cabinet, Claire had arranged a few flowers and herbs around it, creating a look that was both rustic and elegant. "It looks wonderful," Thomas murmured, genuinely impressed. Sophie carefully served each of them, her expression a mix of pride and nerves. "I hope it tastes good," she whispered, biting her lip. With the first bite, Thomas closed his eyes, letting the flavors wash over his senses. The chicken was perfectly tender, the sauce rich and complex with notes of red wine, mushrooms, and fresh herbs. "Sophie," he said, opening his eyes, "this is exceptional." Sophie's face lit up at the compliment. Claire, mouth full, simply nodded and gave a thumbs up. "You know," Thomas went on, savoring another bite, "with a few small tweaks, this could easily be on the menu of a high-end restaurant." The words slipped out before he could think, and suddenly, the reality of what he had just said hit him. Reopening the restaurant. The idea that had seemed a distant dream now felt possible. Sensing the change in his expression, Sophie leaned forward. "Mr. Thomas, have you thought about reopening the little chateau?" Thomas looked around the kitchen, at his grandmother's cookbook, at the girls who had breathed life back into this place. I don't know," he admitted. "It's a daunting idea." "But you're an amazing chef," Claire exclaimed. "And Sophie's almost as good as you now." Sophie blushed at the praise, but her eyes stayed on Thomas, full of hope. Thomas drew a long breath. "Reopening a restaurant is a huge undertaking. We'd need money, staff, suppliers." "But we have your grandmother's recipes," Sophie argued, "and we could start small. Maybe private dinners at first." Thomas's mind began to spin with possibilities. Images of busy tables, the sound of cutlery and laughter, the smell of delicious plates leaving the kitchen. All of it, once lost forever, now felt within reach. "Maybe," he said slowly, "maybe we could try something small. A test dinner for a few friends and old clients." Sophie's face broke into a dazzling smile. "Really? Can we help plan it?" Thomas couldn't help smiling back. The girl's enthusiasm was contagious. "Of course you can. In fact, I'll need your help." Claire clapped her hands excitedly. "I can make invitations and decorate the tables. And I can help put the menu together," Sophie added, already flipping through the cookbook. Watching the two of them dive into a frenzy of planning, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, the little chateau, once just a symbol of his failure, now seemed to pulse with possibility. "All right then," he said, his voice laced with newfound determination. "Let's do it. Let's bring the little chateau back to life." As the girls cheered and began discussing ideas, Thomas glanced one more time at his grandmother's recipe book. He could almost hear her voice. "The kitchen is the heart of the home, Thomas. And now it looks like you've found not just a new kitchen, but a new family." With a smile on his lips and a renewed sense of purpose, Thomas joined the girls in their enthusiastic planning. The little chateau was about to begin a whole new chapter, and he couldn't wait to see what the future held. A knock echoed through the little chateau, interrupting the daily symphony of pots, pans, and laughter that had become so common in recent days. Thomas, hands covered in flour, exchanged a worried look with Sophie before going to answer the door. Standing on the threshold was a middle-aged woman with a neatly pressed suit and a serious expression, holding a folder. "Mr. Lawrence, I'm Elaine Brooks from Social Services." Thomas's heart sank. He had known this day would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. With a silent nod, he invited her in. Sophie and Claire, drawn by the sudden hush, peered around the kitchen door. At the sight of the social worker, Claire's eyes widened in fear, and she ducked behind her older sister. "Mr. Lawrence," Elaine began, her voice professional but not devoid of compassion, "I understand you've been housing Sophie and Claire. They're minors under state care, and their situation needs to be resolved." Thomas felt a knot tighten in his throat. They've been a blessing," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't just send them away." Elaine sighed, her gaze softening slightly. "I understand you've grown attached, Mr. Lawrence, but there are protocols to follow." "However," she paused, glancing at the girls now standing in the kitchen doorway, "seeing that they seem well cared for and Happy. I can give you a week to sort things out. A week, Thomas repeated, the full weight of the situation crashing down on him. Elaine nodded. Yes, 1 week to decide if you want to begin the process of adoption or temporary guardianship. Otherwise, I'll have to return them to the system. Silence followed, heavy with unspoken fears. Sophie was the one who broke it, her small voice determined. Please, Mom, can we stay with Mr. Thomas? He teaches us to cook and takes good care of us. Elaine looked at Sophie, a sad smile tugging at her lips. It's not that simple, dear. But let's see what we can do, all right? Turning back to Thomas, she added, I'll be back in a week. Please think carefully about your decision. After Elaine left, the restaurant fell silent. Claire, tears in her eyes, clung to Thomas's leg. I don't want to go, she sobbed. Thomas knelt down, hugging her gently. Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll figure this out. Sophie, ever the pragmatic one, was already thinking ahead. Mr. Thomas, what if we held that test dinner this week to show we can help with the restaurant? Thomas blinked, surprised at the suggestion. Sophie, I'm not sure if... Please, she pressed, we can modernize some of your grandmother's recipes. Show that we're a good team. Looking at the girls' hopeful faces, Thomas felt his resolve strengthen. You know what? You're right. Let's do it. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Sophie dove into the recipe book, taking notes and suggesting modern twists on classic dishes. Her creativity and refined palate never ceased to amaze Thomas. What if we use lavender in the lamb sauce? She suggested one day, her eyes shining with excitement. It might add a subtle floral note. Thomas considered it a moment before smiling. Brilliant, Sophie. My grandmother would be proud. Claire, not wanting to be left out, took on the task of redesigning the main dining area. With flowers from the garden and fabrics she found in storage, she created a cozy yet elegant feel. As the day of the test dinner approached, Thomas grew increasingly anxious. It wasn't just about impressing guests. He wanted to prove, perhaps mostly to himself, that he still had something to offer. On the eve of the big day, Thomas found Sophie sitting alone in the kitchen, paging through the recipe book with a thoughtful expression. Everything okay, Sophie? He asked gently. She looked up, her eyes glistening. What if it's not good enough? What if they don't like it and we have to leave? Thomas felt his heart ache. Sitting beside her, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Sophie, listen. Whatever happens tomorrow, know this. You and Claire brought life back to this place. And to me, I'm not letting anyone take our little family away. Sophie hugged him tightly, burying her face in his chest. Promise? I promise, Thomas replied, his voice filled with a determination he hadn't felt in years. The day of the dinner arrived with a mix of nerves and excitement. The kitchen buzzed with activity, Thomas and Sophie working in seamless harmony, preparing dish after dish. Claire ran around adjusting flowers and candles, ensuring every detail was perfect. When the first guests arrived, a mix of old friends, loyal former customers, and even a local food critic, Thomas felt the familiar flip of anxiety in his stomach. But then he felt two small hands grasping his. Glancing down, he saw Sophie and Claire smiling up at him, their eyes filled with trust. We're ready, Sophie said. Let's amaze them, Claire added with a radiant grin. At that moment, looking at the two girls who had become so vital to his life in such a short time, Thomas knew that whatever happened that night, he would do anything to keep them close. The little chateau was no longer just a restaurant. It was the beginning of a new family. With a confident smile, Thomas opened the dining room doors. Welcome to the new little chateau, he announced, his voice brimming with pride and hope. The night that would shape his future had just begun. The little chateau hummed with electric energy on the night of the test dinner. The kitchen, silent for so long, now pulsed with life. Dressed once more in his old chef's uniform, Thomas orchestrated movements with the precision of a maestro. Sophie, at his side, worked with intense concentration, her small fingers deftly handling ingredients with remarkable skill for someone her age. In the main dining area, Claire put the final touches on her decorations. Her small hands had transformed the once tired space into something magical. Wildflowers in makeshift vases brightened each table, their vibrant colors contrasting beautifully with crisp white linens. Candles in old, repurposed holders cast a warm, welcoming glow. "It's perfect, Claire," Thomas said, stepping out of the kitchen for a quick inspection. His eyes shone with pride at the little girl's work. Claire beamed, fussing over one last floral arrangement. "Do you think they'll like it, Mr. Thomas?" Before he could answer, a chime sounded, announcing the arrival of the first guests. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. This wasn't just any dinner. It was a shot at redemption, a chance to prove to himself and the world that the little chateau still had something to offer. One by one, the guests arrived, old loyal customers, long-time friends, and even a local restaurant critic whose presence made Thomas swallow hard. Every familiar face carried memories of the restaurant's glory days. "Thomas, my old friend," called out Gerald, a long-time patron, embracing the chef. "It's wonderful to see this place open again." As the guests settled, murmurs of approval filled the air. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. "Who did this charming decor?" asked Mrs. Davies, a local socialite known for her refined taste. Claire, timid but proud, stepped forward. "I did, ma'am." Mrs. Davies's eyes widened in pleasant surprise. "Well, my dear, you have quite a gift." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Thomas and Sophie worked in perfect sync, preparing the menu they'd meticulously planned. Each dish was a fusion of classic tradition and modern flair, honoring his grandmother's recipes while showcasing Sophie's innovative touch. The first dish, a modern twist on onion soup, earned murmurs of appreciation from the dining room. Instead of the traditional crust of cheese, it featured a light Gruyere foam, a suggestion from Sophie that provided a surprising contrast in texture. "This is extraordinary," the food critic muttered, his eyebrows rising in approval at the first sip. Course after course, the guests were amazed and delighted. The duck confit, once a signature dish at the little chateau, now came with a peach and lavender chutney, a bold combination Sophie insisted on trying. Between courses, Thomas peeked into the dining area, anxiously observing the guests' reactions. Every smile and compliment felt like a balm, easing the tension he'd carried for so long. Claire, in her self-appointed role as mini-hostess, made rounds among the tables, charming the patrons with her sweet nature and infectious enthusiasm. "Did you know Mr. Thomas is teaching us how to cook?" she confided to one table of guests. "One day I'm going to make desserts as good as his." Laughter and affectionate smiles followed, warming Thomas's heart. As the evening went on, it became clear the dinner was a resounding success. Plates returned empty to the kitchen, accompanied by glowing praise. The critical moment came with dessert. Thomas and Sophie had worked tirelessly on a reimagined crème brûlée. Inspired by his grandmother's classic, they subtly infused it with lavender and served it alongside a delicate pistachio tuile, Sophie's idea. When the local critic sampled the dessert, a hush fell over the restaurant. All eyes watched him, waiting for his reaction. After what felt like an eternity, he laid down his spoon and fixed his gaze on Thomas. "In all my years as a critic," he began, emotion creeping into his usually stoic voice, "I have rarely tasted something so perfectly balanced. It's as though the past and present have met in perfect harmony on this plate. Thomas, you haven't just returned, you've evolved." Applause erupted throughout the room. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes as the emotion finally overflowed. Sophie ran to hug him, and Claire wasn't far behind. When the last guests left, leaving behind a torrent of praise and promises to return, Thomas gathered the girls in the now quiet dining area. "Well," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I think we have a decision to make." Sophie and Claire gazed up at him expectantly, their eyes bright with hope. "How about we truly reopen the little chateau?" Thomas asked, a slow smile forming. The girls' shrieks of joy were all the answer he needed. As the three of them embraced, laughing and crying at the same time, Thomas knew he had gained far more than a second chance for his restaurant. He had found a family. "Tomorrow," he said, looking at the two small figures in his arms, "we start the official preparations. And also," he added, his voice turning serious, "we'll talk to the social worker. You two aren't going anywhere." That night, As the lights dimmed at the little chateau, 3 hearts brimmed with renewed hope and purpose. The restaurant, like its new guardians, was ready for a new chapter, one full of promise, challenges, and above all, love. Dawn had barely broken when Thomas got up, his mind already buzzing with to-do lists and plans. The success of the test dinner had solidified his decision. The little chateau would reopen, and with it, a new life would begin for him and the girls. His first stop that morning was the office of Elaine Brooks, the social worker. Clutching a folder full of documents and a heart full of resolve, Thomas sat before her. "Mr. Lawrence," Elaine began, flipping through the papers he'd brought. "I see you're taking this very seriously." Thomas nodded, his voice steady. "More than anything in my life, Miss Brooks. Sophie and Claire, they've brought light back into my world. I want to give them the home they deserve." Elaine studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. "It will be a long process, sometimes difficult. There'll be home visits, psychological evaluations, background checks." "I'll do whatever it takes," Thomas interrupted, his determination unwavering. With a small smile, Elaine nodded. "Very well, let's begin the adoption process." Returning to the restaurant, Thomas found Sophie and Claire already at work. Sophie was in the kitchen, surrounded by cookbooks and Thomas's grandmother's recipe notebook, making furious notes. Claire, meanwhile, was in the dining area, cutting up design magazines to create an improvised mood board. "Girls," Thomas called, his heart swelling with affection at the sight of them so focused. "I have news." They looked up, curious. "I started the adoption process," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, there was silence. Then, like a wave, Sophie and Claire rushed to him, throwing their arms around him. No words were needed. The love and gratitude were palpable in the air. With emotions still running high, but with renewed energy, the 3 of them threw themselves into the preparations for the grand reopening. The kitchen became Thomas and Sophie's domain, while Claire reigned supreme in the restaurant's design. Sophie, with a surprising level of maturity for a 10-year-old, spent hours poring over recipes, making subtle adjustments and suggesting inventive flavor pairings. "What if we add a hint of orange to the caramel sauce for the tarte tatin?" she proposed one day. Her eyes lit with culinary excitement. Thomas tasted the sample she'd prepared, his eyes widening at the burst of flavors. "Sophie, that's brilliant!" The menu took shape, a harmonious fusion of classic and modern. Traditional French-inspired dishes met contemporary twists, while new creations paid homage to the little chateau's roots. Meanwhile, Claire transformed the main dining area with her unique vision. Inspired by the stories Thomas told of the English countryside where his grandmother once lived, she designed a theme that blended rustic English charm with modern elegance. "Look, Mr. Thomas," she exclaimed one day, showing off her sketches. "We can use fresh lavender on the tables and maybe hang star-shaped lights from the ceiling." Thomas was in awe of the little girl's creativity. "It's perfect, Claire. Absolutely perfect." As the days passed, the little chateau truly came back to life. The walls got a fresh coat of paint in soft creams and lavender hues. Old furniture was restored, regaining a shine it had lost. The kitchen, its beating heart, was updated with modern equipment, though Thomas insisted on keeping a few vintage items, including his grandmother's old cast-iron stove. Nights were spent with tasting sessions, where Thomas, Sophie, and Claire sampled each dish, refining flavors and presentation. It wasn't unusual to see Claire with a small camera, documenting each creation for the restaurant's new menu and website. Amid the flurry of activity, there were quiet, precious moments. Thomas teaching Sophie the secrets of perfect croissant dough, the delicate layers unfolding under his skilled hands. Claire sitting on Thomas's lap, listening wide-eyed to stories about his grandmother and the restaurant's early days. One evening, while the 3 of them shared a new creation of Sophie's, a cheese soufflé subtly infused with truffle oil, Thomas felt a surge of emotion. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "when I lost everything, I thought I'd never be happy again, that the little chateau was gone forever. But you two—" He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You not only brought the restaurant back to life, You brought me back to life." Sophie and Claire threw their arms around him, forming a tangle of hugs, quiet tears, and gentle laughter. "We're a family now, aren't we?" Claire asked, her voice full of hope. Thomas nodded, momentarily unable to speak. "Yes, my dear, we're a family." As the grand reopening approached, excitement at the little chateau was palpable. The new menu was finalized, an absolute culinary masterpiece bridging the past and future. The dining area was a vision of rustic elegance, exactly as Claire had imagined it. On the night before the grand opening, the three of them stood at the restaurant's entrance, taking in the fruits of their labor. "Are we ready?" Thomas asked, looking at Sophie and Claire. Sophie, determination shining in her eyes, nodded. "More than ready." Claire, holding Thomas's hand, smiled brightly. "Let's show everyone the new little chateau." Thomas felt his heart swell with pride and love. Tomorrow the doors would open again, marking not just the rebirth of a restaurant, but the start of a new life for this improbable, wonderful family. With one last look at the restaurant and then at the girls by his side, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that no matter what the future brought, they would face it together. The little chateau was back, stronger and more vibrant than ever. The long-awaited day arrived at last. The little chateau, revitalized and buzzing with energy, was ready to welcome the world once more. The atmosphere in the restaurant crackled with anticipation and excitement. Thomas, immaculate in his chef's whites, did one final pass through the kitchen. Every utensil was in place, every ingredient meticulously prepped. Sophie, beside him, tightened her own miniature apron, eyes gleaming with both anxiety and determination. "Remember," Thomas said softly, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder, "no matter what happens out there, we're a team." Sophie nodded, a small smile curving her lips. "We're a family," she gently corrected him. In the main dining room, Claire was adding the final flourishes to the decor. The tables were elegantly set, each adorned with a small bunch of fresh lavender, just as she had imagined. The star-shaped lights she'd chosen twinkled overhead, creating a warm, magical atmosphere. As the clock ticked closer to opening time, Thomas gathered everyone, new waitstaff, kitchen helpers, and of course Sophie and Claire, for a final pep talk. "Tonight," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "is not just about food, it's about rebirth, about second chances. Each of you is part of this story. Let's show London what the little chateau is truly made of." A ripple of agreement moved through the group, and with a final nod from Thomas, everyone went to their posts. The moment had arrived. The doors opened, and the first customers stepped inside. The hum of lively conversation soon filled the air, mixing with the soft clink of glassware and the mouth-watering aromas wafting from the kitchen. In the kitchen, Thomas and Sophie moved with flawless coordination, assembling dish after dish with an almost choreographed efficiency. Their new creations, a perfect blend of traditional methods and modern twists, were sent out, each plate a testament to the restaurant's rebirth. Claire, taking on the role of junior hostess, floated from table to table with a poise beyond her 6 years. Her bright smile and sweet comments captivated guests, adding an extra layer of charm to the experience. The evening unfolded smoothly, and Thomas felt a wave of relief. That was when he noticed him, Peter Lefebvre, the feared food critic whose reviews could make or break any London restaurant. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "Sophie," he whispered, "we've got a situation. The Times critic is here." Sophie's eyes went wide for a second, but she quickly composed herself. "Let's impress him, Mr. Thomas," she said, surprising even herself with her confidence. As Peter Lefebvre settled at his table, Thomas and Sophie geared up for the challenge. Every dish sent to the critic was a culinary masterpiece, perfectly showcasing the little chateau's new identity. The first course, a modernized take on onion soup, earned a raised eyebrow of approval. The main course, duck confit with cherry and lavender sauce, one of Sophie's ideas, brought an audible murmur of appreciation. But dessert truly captured the critic's attention. A chocolate soufflé with a salted caramel center and a delicate gold leaf garnish. The moment Peter Lefebvre tasted it, his usually impassive face softened in pure delight. Meanwhile, Claire continued her work in the dining area, her contagious enthusiasm uplifting everyone around her. When a patron accidentally spilled a glass of wine, it was Claire who stepped in, quick to fix the situation and bring a sheepish smile to the embarrassed gentleman. As the night drew to a close, fatigue set in, but it was a rewarding tiredness, mixed with a profound sense of accomplishment. The last customers left with satisfied smiles and promises to return. At last, with the doors locked and the final dish washed, Thomas gathered his little family in the quiet dining room. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were all amazing." Sophie and Claire launched themselves into his arms, a group hug full of exhausted laughter and tearful relief. Yet the euphoria of opening night soon gave way to the daily challenges of running a restaurant. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself juggling the rising demands of the kitchen with the responsibilities of fatherhood. There were tense moments, Sophie's frustration when she couldn't perfectly replicate a complex technique, Claire accidentally breaking an expensive set of plates. But for every challenge, there was a triumph. Sophie inventing a new dish that blew customers away. Claire charming a group of tourists with her adorable English and surprising knowledge of the restaurant's history. One week after the reopening, as Thomas was making breakfast for the girls before heading into another busy day, the phone rang. It was his lawyer, with news about the adoption process. Placing the phone on speaker, Thomas called Sophie and Claire over. "Girls," he said, struggling to contain his excitement, "the judge approved our first hearing. We're one step closer to being an official family." The girls' shouts of joy filled the kitchen, blending with the aroma of fresh coffee and baking croissants. Thomas glanced around at the bustling kitchen, the restaurant beyond, and the smiling faces of Sophie and Claire. The little chateau had been reborn. More importantly, a family had taken shape. And Thomas knew, with a warmth spreading through his heart, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together, with love, creativity, and of course, plenty of good food. The months following the little chateau's reopening were a whirlwind of activity. The once-forgotten restaurant became the talk of the town. The glowing review in the Times by Peter Lefebvre had been just the beginning. Soon, food blogs, lifestyle magazines, and even an international TV network were clamoring to learn the story behind the restaurant's renaissance. Thomas could hardly believe the transformation. The tables were always full, reservations booked weeks in advance, and a steady buzz of animated conversation and laughter filled the space that, not so long ago, had been silent and deserted. But with success came new challenges. Thomas found himself juggling the restaurant's soaring demands with his responsibilities as Sophie and Claire's guardian. Late nights in the kitchen often led to rushed mornings, helping with homework and breakfast before school. One particularly hectic morning, as Thomas struggled to braid Claire's hair, a skill he had yet to master, while quizzing Sophie on her English vocabulary, he felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down. "Girls," he said, a trace of exhaustion in his voice, "you know I love you and the restaurant, but sometimes I wonder if I'm doing everything right." Perceptive as always, Sophie placed her hand on his. "You're doing your best, Mr. Thomas. We're learning too." Claire nodded so enthusiastically that she nearly undid Thomas's clumsy braiding. "Yeah. We're a team, remember?" Their words reassured Thomas. He pulled them both into a tight hug, feeling a wave of gratitude for the improvised family they had become. At the restaurant, Sophie continued to amaze everyone with her culinary creativity. She spent hours in the kitchen, testing new flavor combinations and refining her techniques, always under Thomas's proud and watchful eye. One day, while working on a new seasonal menu, Sophie grew uncharacteristically quiet. Thomas found her sitting in a corner of the kitchen, flipping through an old photo album. "What have you got there, Sophie?" he asked gently. She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "They're pictures of my parents," she said softly. "Today marks a year since the accident." Thomas's heart tightened. Sitting down next to her, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Do you want to tell me about them?" Sophie smiled through her tears. "Mom loved to cook. She always said a good meal could cure any sadness." "And Dad?" "He loved flowers. Our garden was the prettiest on our street." Thomas listened as Sophie shared her memories, his chest filling with admiration for this resilient young girl. "You know," Sophie said suddenly, a spark in her eyes, "I think I'd like to create a dish in their honor." Over the following days, Sophie worked tirelessly on her tribute. Thomas watched in awe as she combined elements representing her parents: a creamy risotto delicately infused with rose essence, topped with crystallized edible petals. When Thomas finally tasted the finished dish, tears stung his eyes. "Sophie, this is extraordinary. Your parents would be so proud." Named Memory Risotto, Sophie's creation quickly became the most popular item on the menu. Customers were touched, not just by its exquisite taste, but by the heartfelt story behind it. Meanwhile, Claire continued to develop her own talents. Inspired by the changing seasons, she devised a quarterly decoration plan for the restaurant. Every 3 months, the little chateau took on a fresh look that reflected the unique beauty of that time of year. For autumn, Claire introduced warm tones of gold and red, with arrangements of dried leaves and miniature gourds. In winter, the restaurant transformed into a snowy fairy tale, with branches dusted in snow and twinkling fairy lights. Spring burst into vibrant blooms, fresh flowers at every table, and summer brought the light-hearted air of the countryside, with lavender and sunflowers taking center stage. Diners marveled at each transformation, many returning season after season to see the new decor and taste the special menus Thomas and Sophie created to complement the ambiance. One day, while Claire was explaining her concept for winter decorations to a design magazine journalist, Thomas felt a wave of such intense pride it nearly overwhelmed him. That evening, after closing, Thomas gathered the girls in the kitchen. "I have something for you," he said, handing each of them a small package. Sophie and Claire opened their gifts eagerly, revealing personalized chef's jackets. Sophie's read Chef Sophie in gold lettering, while Claire's read Creative Director Claire. "You're no longer just my apprentices," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're integral parts of this restaurant, of this family. We couldn't have done this without you." The girls hugged him tightly, their laughter and tears of joy echoing in the kitchen. Later, lying in bed, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey they had taken. The little chateau wasn't just a revived restaurant. It was the heart of a family that had found each other under the most unlikely circumstances. With a grateful smile, Thomas drifted off to sleep, thankful for the path fate had laid out for him and his girls, and eager for the adventures still to come. Autumn had arrived in London, carrying a crisp breeze and the promise of change. At the little chateau, Claire was busy preparing the seasonal decor, transforming the restaurant into a cozy autumn haven. While rearranging items in Thomas's old office, now used for storage, she noticed a dusty box hidden behind a shelf. Ever curious, Claire pulled the box out, causing a mini avalanche of papers. "Oops," she muttered, hastily gathering up the scattered documents. That was when she spotted something, a worn brown folder stamped with confidential in bold red. "Mr. Thomas," Claire called, her voice echoing down the hallway. "I think I found something important." Thomas, who had been in the kitchen discussing the autumn menu with Sophie, heard Claire's urgency and frowned. He and Sophie exchanged worried looks before hurrying to the office. Stepping inside, Thomas found Claire sitting on the floor, surrounded by old papers, holding the mysterious folder. "What have you got there, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Claire held out the folder, her big eyes full of curiosity. "It was behind the shelf, looks important." Thomas took the folder, feeling the familiar weight of long-buried secrets. With a deep sigh, he opened it and felt his stomach drop. "Sophie," he said, his voice shaky, "could you take Claire to make us some tea? I think we'll need it." Sensing something serious, Sophie nodded and gently guided Claire out of the office, casting a final worried glance Thomas's way before closing the door. Alone, Thomas delved into the documents. As he read, a dormant anger he hadn't known he still possessed began to simmer in his chest. Bank statements, forged contracts, duplicated invoices, all pointing to a grand scheme of fraud orchestrated by his former partner, Robert. Pieces of the puzzle that led to the little chateau's bankruptcy years ago clicked into place. Robert, whom Thomas had trusted implicitly, had systematically siphoned funds from the restaurant, manipulated the accounts, and left Thomas saddled with the debts. By the time Sophie returned with tea, she found Thomas at his old desk, head in his hands, documents spread out before him. "Mr. Thomas?" she asked softly, setting the tea tray down. "Are you all right?" Thomas looked up, his eyes red and weary. "Oh, Sophie," he sighed, "I think we just discovered the real reason the little chateau went under all those years ago." Over the next few minutes, Thomas explained the situation to Sophie as best he could, given her age. He spoke about broken trust, about how the people we consider friends can sometimes hurt us most. Sophie listened, her expression a mix of confusion and indignation. "But that's not fair," she cried when Thomas finished. "You worked so hard and he just stole everything." Thomas nodded sadly. "Life isn't always fair, Sophie, but what matters is how we respond to the injustice." Just then, Claire tapped timidly on the door. "Can I come in? The tea's getting cold." Thomas mustered a faint smile, waving her in. Claire nestled beside Sophie on the sofa, her eyes flitting between Thomas and the papers on the desk. "Did I do something wrong by finding those papers?" she asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart," Thomas reassured her. "You actually did something very important. You helped us discover the truth." With the girls by his side, Thomas found himself explaining again, this time in a way both of them could understand. He told them about Robert and how he had deceived Thomas, causing the restaurant's downfall. "But now we have proof," Sophie said, her eyes flashing with determination. "We can do something about it, right?" Thomas hesitated. The idea of dredging up such a painful period, of possibly entering a legal battle, terrified him. But looking into Sophie's and Claire's hopeful faces, he felt a new resolve growing within him. "You're right, Sophie," he finally said. "We can do something. The question is, what should we do?" The next few hours were spent in intense family discussion. Sophie, with her practical nature, insisted on immediate justice. "We should go to the police," she said. "What he did was wrong, and he should be punished." Claire, on the other hand, worried more about how it would affect Thomas emotionally. "What if it makes Mr. Thomas sad again? I don't want him to be sad." Thomas listened to them both, his heart swelling with love and pride for the girls who weren't just concerned about the injustice, but also about him. Finally, after much debate, Thomas made his decision. "Girls," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I appreciate your concern. And you both made valid points." Pausing, he looked at the documents on the desk and then back at Sophie and Claire. "I think the right thing to do is pursue justice, not just for me, but for everyone who was hurt by the bankruptcy, our former employees, suppliers, customers who believed in us." Sophie nodded vigorously, while Claire still looked slightly uneasy. "But," Thomas went on, "we're not going to let this consume our lives or change who we've become. The little chateau has been reborn, and that's more important than any revenge." Standing, he extended his hands to the girls. "How about we face this together, as a family?" Sophie and Claire placed their hands in his, forming a small circle. "Together," Sophie said firmly. "As a family," Claire echoed, a faint smile curving her lips. That night, after the girls were in bed, Thomas stayed up, replaying the day's events. Discovering those papers had ripped open old wounds, but it also brought the possibility of closure. He was no longer the helpless victim he'd been years ago. Now he had a purpose, a family, and a thriving restaurant. Gazing out the window at London's twinkling lights, Thomas made a silent promise. He would seek justice, yes, but he wouldn't let the past overshadow the bright future he was building with Sophie and Claire. With renewed determination, Thomas picked up the phone. It was time to make a call he'd been putting off for far too long. "Hello, Dr. Miller. This is Thomas Lawrence. We need to talk about some documents I found." As the conversation unfolded, Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever the outcome, he knew he wouldn't face the coming storm alone. With Sophie and Claire by his side, he felt ready for anything. The chapter on the little chateau's bankruptcy would finally be closed, and a new one, brimming with hope and possibility, was just beginning. The law office of Dr. Miller was quiet, save for the low hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of papers. Thomas sat rigidly in a leather chair, hands clasped in his lap to hide their tremor. Beside him, Sophie and Claire occupied identical chairs, their presence offering silent comfort. Dr. Miller, a middle-aged man with thin-framed glasses, studied the documents Thomas had brought, his face set in a mask of professional concentration. "Well, Mr. Lawrence," he finally said, glancing over the top of his glasses, "these documents are, without a doubt, incriminating. We have a strong case against your former partner, Robert Adams." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So, what now? What's the next step?" "First, we need to confront Mr. Adams with this evidence," Dr. Miller explained. "Give him a chance to respond before we move forward with any legal proceedings." The thought of facing Robert after all these years made Thomas's stomach churn. As if sensing his apprehension, Sophie reached for his hand, giving him a reassuring smile. 2 days later, Thomas found himself in a conference room with Dr. Miller at his side, awaiting Robert's arrival. When the door opened, it felt like stepping back in time. Robert walked in, still projecting the same confident air Thomas remembered, though grey now streaked his dark hair. "Thomas?" Robert exclaimed, a false grin on his lips. "Long time no see. I heard you reopened the little chateau. Congratulations." Thomas felt anger flare but held his composure. "Have a seat, Robert. We have a lot to discuss." As Dr. Miller presented the evidence, Robert's smile gradually faded, replaced by a sickly pallor. His eyes darted from document to document, the realization that he'd been caught settling in. This is a misunderstanding," Robert stammered, his usual charm vanishing. "I can explain. Explain how you systematically stole from me and the restaurant," Thomas interrupted, voice shaking with contained emotion. "How you betrayed my trust and wrecked something I spent years building." Robert slumped in his chair, defeated. I'm sorry, Thomas. It spiraled out of control. I never meant for it to go this far." "Sorry isn't enough, Robert," Thomas replied, voice now steady. "You have 2 options. Fully cooperate, return what you took, and face the legal consequences, or we take this straight to the authorities." In the days that followed, a series of tense negotiations took place. Realizing he had no choice, Robert agreed to cooperate. With Dr. Miller's guidance, Thomas began the legal process of recovering lost funds, and more importantly, his reputation. The proceedings were grueling, endless hours spent giving statements, reviewing documents, and negotiating deals. Thomas often returned home late, exhausted, only to be met by Sophie and Claire's welcoming smiles and a hot meal. "How was it today?" Sophie would ask, concern in her eyes. "Tough," Thomas would answer honestly, "but we're making progress." Claire, in her childlike wisdom, often offered the most comforting words. "Remember, Mr. Thomas, you're stronger than all this mess. You rebuilt the restaurant from nothing." Those simple words, from the pure heart of a child, were often exactly what Thomas needed to renew his determination. At last, after weeks of legal battles, the final court date arrived. The courtroom was packed not only with lawyers and officials, but also with former employees of the little chateau, loyal patrons, and curious reporters. When the judge entered, a tense hush fell over the room. Thomas felt Sophie squeeze his hand on one side and Claire's on the other, forming a small but powerful family unit. The verdict was read. Robert Adams was found guilty of fraud and embezzlement. He was ordered to pay substantial restitution to Thomas and the little chateau, and faced prison time as well. But for Thomas, the true victory came with the judge's next words. Furthermore, this court officially acknowledges that Mr. Thomas Lawrence was the victim of this elaborate fraud. His name is fully cleared of any wrongdoing related to the little chateau's former bankruptcy. A ripple of approval swept through the courtroom. Thomas felt as though a massive weight had lifted from his shoulders. Years of guilt, shame, and self-doubt were washed away in an instant. Exiting the courthouse, Thomas was swarmed by reporters eager for his story. With Sophie and Claire at his side, he faced the cameras with a newfound confidence. "The little chateau has always been more than just a restaurant to me," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "It was a dream, a passion. Losing it was devastating. But thanks to the incredible support I received, He paused, smiling at Sophie and Claire. "I managed not only to rebuild the restaurant, but also my life." In the days that followed, Thomas's story dominated the headlines. Wronged chef triumphs. The Little Chateau's rebirth. From bankruptcy to redemption, Thomas Lawrence's journey. The restaurant, already popular, experienced an even greater surge in business, with many wanting to witness the redemption story firsthand. One night, about a week after the final hearing, Thomas was in the Little Chateau's kitchen preparing dinner for his small family. Sophie worked alongside him, learning how to make a delicate sauce, while Claire arranged the table with her trademark artistic flair. "You know," Thomas said, pausing mid-prep to look at the girls, "amid all the legal chaos, I almost forgot to say something very important to you both." Sophie and Claire glanced up, curious. "If it weren't for you two, none of this would have been possible," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a reason to rebuild the restaurant, the courage to face my past. You are my family, my strength." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and Claire ran to hug Thomas. "And you're our hero, Mr. Thomas," Sophie said softly. "Our family," Claire added, her voice muffled against Thomas's apron. In that moment, surrounded by the comforting sense of a home-cooked meal and the warmth of familial love, Thomas felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The Little Chateau was no longer merely a revived restaurant. It was the heart of a family that had discovered redemption and love in one another. As they sat down for dinner, Thomas raised his glass in a toast. "To family," he said, "and to new beginnings." "To family and new beginnings," Sophie and Claire echoed, their faces glowing with happiness. The clink of their glasses mingled with laughter, filling the kitchen with a promise of a bright future, filled with love, good food, and boundless possibilities. Spring had arrived in London, bringing a burst of color and a sense of renewal. At the Little Chateau, excitement and anticipation hung in the air. Thomas, Sophie, and Claire stood before the mirror in the entry hall, adjusting their outfits. Today wasn't just any day, it was the day they would officially become a family in the eyes of the law. "Ready?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. Sophie and Claire nodded, their faces radiant with joy. Together, they stepped out of the restaurant and into the car, headed for the final step on their journey toward legal recognition as a family. The courthouse was calm when they arrived, hands linked. The judge, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled as she saw them enter. She had followed the case from the start and was clearly moved by this moment. "Thomas Lawrence," she began, her tone solemn, "you are here today to formally adopt Sophie and Claire. Do you understand the responsibilities you're undertaking?" Thomas looked at the girls, his heart brimming with love. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand and embrace every one of them with all my heart." The judge then turned to Sophie and Claire. "And you, girls, do you wish to become the legal daughters of Thomas Lawrence?" "Yes," they answered in unison, voices overflowing with happiness. Smiling warmly, the judge signed the final documents. "Then it is with great pleasure that I declare you now, legally and irrevocably, a family." The sound of the gavel was drowned out by cheers of joy and tears of happiness. Thomas hugged Sophie and Claire, feeling like his heart might burst with love. "Dad," Sophie whispered, testing the word for the first time. "Our dad." Tears slipped down Thomas's cheeks at that simple, powerful word. "My daughters," he replied, voice trembling with emotion. "My wonderful daughters." Exiting the courthouse, they were greeted by a small crowd of friends, staff from the Little Chateau, and even a few regular patrons who had become part of their lives. Rose petals were tossed, applause rang out, and the air was filled with congratulations and well wishes. Back at the restaurant, a surprise awaited the newly official Lawrence family. A formal letter rested on the main table, stamped with the official seal of the Culinary Academy of Britain. With shaking hands, Thomas opened the envelope and read aloud. "It is with great pleasure that we announce the Little Chateau has been selected to receive this year's award for culinary excellence. The innovative creativity, commitment to British culinary tradition, and the remarkable story of the establishment's rebirth have captured the attention and hearts of our committee." Stunned silence filled the room, followed by shouts of joy and emotional embraces. Sophie jumped with excitement while Claire twirled in circles, scattering the rose petals still in her basket. "Dad," Sophie said, eyes shining, "we did it. We really turned the little chateau into something special." Thomas grinned, pulling them both close. "No, sweetheart, we did this. It's a victory for our family." That evening, the little chateau closed its doors to the public. Instead, the tables were arranged in a large circle in the main dining room, hosting their extended family, staff, close friends, and everyone who had supported them through it all. The kitchen hummed with activity as Thomas and Sophie prepared a special feast. Claire's, meanwhile, orchestrated the ambiance, transforming the dining room into a fairy tale setting with soft lights and elaborate floral arrangements. As guests arrived and took their seats, Thomas pulled Sophie and Claire aside to a quiet corner of the kitchen. With a secretive smile, he handed each girl a wrapped package. "What's this, Dad?" Claire asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Open it and see," Thomas replied, barely containing his excitement. With eager fingers, they tore the wrapping, revealing two beautifully bound hardcover books. On each cover, in gold lettering, was written, "The Little Chateau Treasury, Family Recipes." "These are," Sophie began, her voice catching. "Copies of my grandmother's recipe book," Thomas finished. "But not just copies. I added every recipe we've created together these past months. Our story, our journey, is in these pages." Claire leafed through her book with reverence. "Look, Sophie, here's your special risotto recipe." Tears glistened in Sophie's eyes as she hugged Thomas. "Thank you, Dad. This means more than you can imagine." Thomas kissed the tops of their heads, feeling a surge of love and gratitude. "You two are the real treasure. These books are just a reminder of that." The feast that followed was a celebration of love, family, and fine food. Dishes inspired by the recipes in the new book were served, each one telling part of the little chateau's story and the Lawrence family's journey. When it was time for dessert, Thomas stood, raising his glass. The lively chatter subsided, and all eyes turned to him. "A little over a year ago," he began, voice thick with emotion, "I was alone, defeated, without hope. The little chateau was merely a painful reminder of all I'd lost." He paused, his gaze settling tenderly on Sophie and Claire. Then, on a stormy night, two little angels knocked on my door. They didn't just bring light back into my life, they gave me a reason to dream again, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "Today, we're celebrating many things. The official adoption of Sophie and Claire, the recognition of our beloved restaurant, but above all, we celebrate the power of love, family, and resilience." He lifted his glass higher. "To the little chateau, not just a restaurant, but the heart of our family. And to family, the one we choose, the one we build, the one that holds us up in our darkest moments." "To family," everyone echoed, glasses chiming in unison. As the evening wore on, brimming with laughter, storytelling, and the promise of a bright future, Thomas looked around the room, Sophie animatedly discussing culinary techniques with a visiting chef, Claire enchanting guests with her ideas for the next seasonal decor. In that moment, Thomas understood the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't in bank accounts or public acclaim. It was in the bonds we form, the lives we touch, the love we share. The little chateau had indeed been reborn. More importantly, a family had been forged, one brought together by hardship, strengthened by love, and fueled by a shared passion for good food and cherished moments. As the final dessert was served, a majestic chocolate soufflé symbolizing the restaurant's own rise, Thomas made a silent vow. Whatever the future held, they would face it together as a family. Because, in the end, he realized, the greatest treasure wasn't in awards or a successful restaurant. It was in the smiles of his daughters, the joy shared around the table, and the love they had built together. The little chateau wasn't merely a restaurant. It was a home, a story of redemption, and above all, the beating heart of a family that had found their way back to each other.